who is one of the UK's most celebrated food historians, broadcasters, writers, and curators, who specialises in the reconstruction of period kitchens and historic table displays. His work has been exhibited in many institutions worldwide, including the Museum of London, the Metropolitan Museum, and the Getty Research Institute. Its publications include Cooking in Europe, 1650 to 1850, and Ice Cream, A History. And we were very pleased to welcome Ivan recently into the museum to have a closer look at the collection that we have here of ice pails. It was a very wonderful visit, so thank you, Ivan. And over to you. I very much look forward to this talk.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for making me so welcome when I came down. It was a wonderful day, and the essence of what I experienced is going to be shown to everybody over the next 45 minutes or so. Before I look at porcelain and ice cream, I think I'm just going to say a little bit about myself and my history of working with porcelain and other decorative arts of the table. So in the early 90s, I was invited by Dr. Howard Coots at the Bowes Museum, which is a wonderful collection, to be the guest curator of an exhibition called The Tempting Table. They had period rooms at the museum, and the idea was to turn each of them into a dining space and have a table in it. So I think we did 6 rooms. One of them was an 18th century space. I wanted to really look at porcelain in the dessert in England. So we selected a number of English manufactury pieces, including some lovely Worcester. You can see 4 of those lovely sort of corner leaf plates there from a fairly early period dessert service. It'd be Dr. Wall. But we also used a Hans Sloane Chelsea service, a botanic service, and some Derby figures. So what I did was I took these items and I transformed them into a Georgian dessert table, and this is the result. The room it was in came from Chesterfield House, and the panelling is the very earliest example of a Rococo interior in Britain. The house was in London, and it was the home of the 4th Earl of Chesterfield, who was a real Francophile. So what I wanted to do in this space was to show his interest in French dining, but using English porcelain. So the 4 little Worcester vine plates are in the corners, which is what they were designed for. They've got those little handles. But you'll see also flanking the sugar temple or palace in the middle, which comes from a French design. There are 2 absolutely superb early period Worcester fruit baskets. So the idea was really to sort of recreate what this after course, after you've had all of your savoury foods and a few puddings as well, you sit down and you have these little sugary nibbles. We also used silver from the period, a lot of glass, wonderful collection in the Bowes Museum, and cutlery too, including the table textile, which is also an 18th century tablecloth. You'll notice that the idea in that was to create a kind of garden in the middle of the table. And the Chelsea plates, which were very much part of a kind of naturalism that was introduced because of the interest in botany at the period and gardening. The gardening theme started much earlier. In the Tudor period, when Italians started to put sort of artificial tables, artificial gardens made of edible materials in the middle of the table. And this is an early 17th century recreation I did recently, just round about the time of COVID, at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And this time there's no porcelain on the table because there weren't any European manufactories, and that people were buying, of course, Chinese and Japanese porcelain, and even making imitation porcelain out of sugar. And the little blue cobalt decorated cracked dishes you can see there are actually made out of sugar. And there are also some tatzer, which are made from sugar, but there's also Augsburg and Nuremberg silver, a very important glass goblet that you can see there, and lots of little early 17th century fruit trenchers painted with designs. The tablecloth itself is Low Countries from about 1590. So that's as close as you can get, really, to an early dessert setting. It was called a banquet setting, and it was served after the main meal. Later on in 2004, I returned to the Bose Museum and created this Empire period table setting um, with a Sèvres service, which you can't see very well because it's a 19th century Sèvres service. It's actually covered with the foods of a very, very grand dessert with lots of sugar paste ornaments as well. Um, this exhibition came about because I discovered a set of really important confectioners' molds which were for sale, and we managed, with the help of the Arts Collection Fund and the Lottery Fund, to buy them for the Bose Museum, and I used them to create a lot of those sugar paste objects that you can see. But among them was an extraordinary wooden mold, which should have really been in the recent V&A exhibition, because you can see at the top that it's got the cipher of Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette below a mold which makes a basket out of sugar, not out of porcelain. There was also a little kind of cartouche with dolphin legs, which created a kind of table marker with the cipher or the coat of arms of the guest. And on the back of this mould is the coat of arms of the Princess de Lamballe, who was Marie Antoinette's kind of favourite at the time. And I created the table marker for her with her arms out of sugar. It looks like it's porcelain, but behind it is a Sèvres kind of dessert dish that belonged to Marie Antoinette, which was lent to us by Lord Rothschild for the exhibition. And if you look at those sugar flowers, you can see that they're actually in a little basket, not made of porcelain, but made of sugar. And in my career, I've tried to trace this extraordinary relationship that these confectioners' table ornaments, which were edible, had with the development of porcelain. I've worked with other exhibitions, other museums. This was at Chatsworth, where I was asked to create this wonderful display of silver in this incredible room, this sort of state room in Chatsworth from the 1690s. So I tend to work with a lot of silver, and also I create table settings purely with confectioner's ornaments, although we did make the surtout, that gilt surtout for this. This was at the Getty Museum. So those figures are not made of porcelain, they're made out of sugar, and we wanted to actually trace this kind of link between these early edible ornaments and what happens later on, particularly at Sèvres with the biscuit figures. So I've also worked at Wadson with the Rothschild collection, and this was one of my favourite exhibitions ever. And this was an extraordinary Sèvres service that was given as a gift by Louis XV to one of his ministers, Vicomte de Choiseul, the Choiseul service. And we created again a full dessert with a plateau and various biscuit figures from the Starenburg service. And wonderful. Look at this. This is one of my most favourite objects in the universe. This extraordinary fruit basket with artificial fruits made out of almond paste in them. Probably one of the pinnacles of my career was doing this in the the Bard Graduate Center in New York in 2007, working with the Meissen scholar Maureen Cassidy Geiger, who's a very good friend. And she managed to negotiate the loan of this extraordinary Meissen centerpiece. It's a Parnassus that was given as a diplomatic gift by the second elector of Saxony to the Empress of Russia, Elizabeth. And I had a lot of fun doing this. An incredibly ornate bit of Baroque sculpture with candlesticks from the St. Andrew's service, a Russian service, and again, some of those wonderful plates. And then that led to a very important exhibition I worked on at the Met of Dupaquier porcelain. I worked with Meredith Chilton and Geoffrey Munger, great scholars of Dupaquier, and they gave me the job of recreating the Empress's kind of coronation feast. Here it is in a 1740 engraving, and you can see Maria Theresia there. And so I recreated those central baldacchini out of sugar. This is a setup photograph before it was complete. But all of the porcelain on there is Dupaquier Vienna porcelain. Of course, the Empress bought it and she became the chief pixie of the Dupaquier manufactory. Quite an experience. And then more recently, coming back to England, I worked with this extraordinary late 18th, probably early 19th century Derby dessert service with wonderful ornaments by Quaker Peg, the famous decorator there of, again, botanical subjects. And of course, this particular service does include a pair of ice pails or seau à glace. This is one of them with these lovely English ornaments on it. And that is what I want to talk about, is this particular object. And I'll move on to ice cream and some of the other related equipage a little bit later on. So let's go to Worcester. And I spent a lot of time interrogating this extraordinary object. What you have is something which in France was called a seau à glace. It's a three-part vessel. The largest part is the pail, which you put ice into. And there is a basin, which you're looking at on the left. You're looking at it, from, it would fit into the middle of that. And then there's a kind of cover on the top, which has got this wall, which you can put more ice into. So basically, you put ice into the bottom, ice into the top, you put the basin in, you put them all together and let it get really cold. But what you had to do, and people don't understand this, particularly ceramic curators, that in order for it to work, you have to put salt in it as well. And I'll come to the issues that were with that a little bit later on. But what I'd like to do is to interrogate this object, because it is one of my favorite things in the museum in Worcester, if not in the entire universe, really. It's completely bonkers with these eccentric birds, but all sorts of other features too. So this is the cover, which holds the ice, and you can see the Sèvres Rococo influence, particularly with the handle at the top. It's really lavishly decorated, beautiful enameling of these exotic birds, wonderful gilding. But when you start looking into it, you see it's got so many other features. There are not only birds, there are butterflies inside. The landscape continues on the outside. And then when you really go in, you find that all of this would have been concealed, not on the table, because they probably never went onto the table. They would have been on a sideboard or a console table. But you can see that underneath the ice, hidden away, are little ladybirds and other bugs, butterflies, moths. And of course, this particular object, which dates from probably about 1780, we're talking really about the sort of William Davis period. Dr. Wall has retired a bit earlier on, so it's a little bit later on. It's known as the Lord Rodney service, and it was likely made for Admiral Rodney, and eventually came onto the market through his family, and it's always been called the Lord Rodney service. There are other elements of it about that. This one is another one at Worcester, and you can see it's got the same kind of birds, but each plate was different, and the artist tackled them in many different ways. But again, if you start looking very closely, there's a kind of motif where you can see the artist has just had so much fun. There's all these spiders and bugs, which is very, very typical of Worcester, but you get it also in Chelsea too, in another early manufactory. And these are just so much fun. They're just extraordinary. And in the archives, I came across this wonderful pattern book from the sort of Chamberlain period, and you can see again the artist who's put this together is not only playing around with these sort of mosaic designs, which are going to be gilded, but doing some ladybirds, some moths, and other things. So this particular ice pail, with its very exotic, I think they're completely bonkers birds, is something which we see also in an earlier piece. This is your Dr. Ward James Giles period. It's alleged to be a bowl, a dairy bowl, for putting a kind of cream in. And again, it's so free. It's nothing like some of the much more formal bird designs that you get, for instance, at Sèvres, and a big moth on it. And there's a theory about this. It's got a red anchor mark on the bottom, and there's some sort of theory that it may have been a replacement for one that had gone missing from a Chelsea dessert service. I'm not really sure. But this is a huge contrast to the very formal, extremely aristocratic birds that you get in Sèvres porcelain in the 1770s. This is a service which is one of the largest ever made at Sèvres, with wonderful bird designs on it in this celestial blue background. This was from the Prince de Rohan service, the Cardinal Rohan, who was a bit of a character. Marie Antoinette had some terrible dealings with him, as did her mother, and he wasn't very popular with the royal family. But this is an extraordinary multi-part service. It's scattered around everywhere. This is actually a wine cooler. I wanted to show you this because you can see that the shape is very, very similar to that of an ice pail, except it doesn't have the other two components. And it's for putting a wine bottle in, well, a much wider wine bottle than we have now, because you remember the kind of bell-shaped wine bottles they had in the 18th century. I'll show you later on. But I just wanted to point out that these birds, these opulent tropical birds, were appearing on European porcelain, a little bit earlier than they were at Worcester, but that was the fashion. Now, this is from the same service, and this time we are looking at an early Sèvres Sew à Glace from 1771, again from the Rohan service. So the fashion for these exotic birds came from a number of sources. You've got to remember this is the Enlightenment. You've got a lot of scientists beginning to really get interested in the natural world. And England, we had George Edwards, who was an extraordinary naturalist who produced numerous books with illustrations, not just of birds, but other animals and plants too. And in France, we also had Georges Louis Leclerc, who produced this wonderful book of illustrations of birds. And the illustrators and decorators at the manufactories often had the prints out of these books in front of them. This is a couple of plates from George Edwards' book. And I just put this in because it's one of these books that's incredibly valuable and very difficult to get, but you can get the whole text and illustrations of it from the Biodiversity Heritage Library if you want to make a note of that and look it up, which is really a lot of fun because you can get inside the minds of the porcelain ornamenters as well as the ornithologists of the period. And of course, again, look, can you see the butterflies that are included in that one on the left, which is very much part of the zeitgeist of that period. The Prince de Rohan service has a number of tasses à glace. These are the ice cream cups that ice cream was served in. And I had the great privilege some time ago about using some of these in Washington, D.C. at the Hillwood Museum. I'll show it to you a little bit later on when I did a full table setting with them. But let's move back to Worcester. This is not in the museum in Worcester. This is actually in Houston, in the Museum of Fine Art. And this is a Jabberwocky pattern ice cream pail from about 1770. Um, the bird illustrations obviously had their inspiration from Sèvres. This was more influenced by Meissen porcelain, particularly ones that were based on Japanese designs. And the Jabberwocky dragon, which is incredibly eccentric, is in there. It's a lot of fun. But I'm showing you this to make a point about these objects from Worcester. They're much more profusely decorated than from any other European manufactory. And what is unusual is the inside of the bowl is often decorated, as well as the little top, which has the ice in it. One is full of ice cream, so the diners don't get to see that until the end of the meal, perhaps. And the other one is full of ice, so that doesn't get seen. But this happens, throughout Worcester. You get this. Every inch is covered with designs, often little insects, all sorts of things. The Jabberwocky pattern is nicely represented in the Worcester Museum with this dessert plate, again with ornamentation with James Giles, but you can see it's got this mosaic kind of Laubund Bandelwerk kind of design, which is typical of Meissen and Vienna porcelain. So its lineage, the design's lineage, goes back to Central Europe rather than to France. But let's have a look at another one. This is another early period um, wonderful ice cream seau à glace with its bowl, with its lid, and with its pail, and beautifully decorated with this sort of partridge eye design, very much based on Sèvres. Again, look at the handle and the shape. So that's the inside. Again, you can see that they pulled the stops out, these guys, when they ornamented these things. Absolutely superb, encrusted and completely congested with these delicate, beautiful flowers. And that's the bowl, which would be, it's a bit like one of those clocks where the most ornate bit is the back, which is to the back, is to the mantelpiece. And there you are. You don't get to see these because it's full of ice cream. Moving on a little bit, another object I fell in love with when I was in the museum is this slightly later. This is a Flight and Bar ice pail, which has its actual bowl missing. It just has the lid, but it's a splendid thing covered in these beautiful grapes. And I wondered whether there might have been a matching bottle cooler as well with it. I don't know. But again, it just shows the versatility of this early period at Worcester. And then really we come to probably the crowning glories of Regency ice cream equipage, some ice pails that were ornamented by the genius Thomas Baxter, who died very young, I think in his late 30s. And he was extraordinary. Everything has changed. This is almost like a tureen rather than an ice cream pail. And it's sitting on this Sockler square base, which becomes very typical in the early 19th century. But it's a masterpiece, again, of naturalism and decoration, extraordinary gilding, and look at the detail in these seashells. So I guess ice cream was a very exotic new thing in the 18th and early 19th century, mainly just for the elite, really. It was such an expensive process to make it. And you just had to have these de rigueur objects to serve it in. There's a pair of these, and the other set is ornamented with these beautiful roses and I think peonies as well. And there he is. This is a lovely little extraordinary self-portrait painted by Baxter on ivory, which I never got to see, but is in the museum collection. And then finally, really, in the 19th century, one of the great so glass. This was a set of four that was commissioned for the coronation of William IV, which should have taken place in 1831. Unfortunately, the Duke of Wellington at the time knew that there was grain shortages, there were riots happening on the streets, and he advised the king not to have his coronation feast. And it didn't happen. It would never happened again. The last one was that of his brother, George IV, a bit earlier on. Um, what happened was the full set wasn't completed actually until a little bit later, until 1833, and it was eventually used by William for, I think he entertained an important French aristocrat, and it was used at the dinner there. But you can see the royal arms. The top has got this finial, which is gilded, and there are these sort of light pale yellow reserves, which have got the insignia of various sort of British orders, heraldic orders, like the one on the bottom left-hand side shows George and the Dragon. And eventually this was used and still is used for Garter feasts. So if you have the Order of the Garter, you might actually get to see this when you go to St. George's Hall in Windsor. But that coronation feast that didn't happen is quite interesting because the Duke of Wellington also told the Lord Mayor in the year before that he couldn't have his Lord Mayor's feast because of the riots on the streets. There were food shortages, and he thought that the government would probably fall if they gave one of these incredibly lavish feasts. John Key, who was the mayor at the time, became the subject of ridicule. And here you see him having a nightmare. This is based on that very famous image by Henry Fuseli called The Nightmare, where there's a demon sitting on a woman's breast while she's asleep. She's having a nightmare. And here his feast is actually attacking him, and he's warding them off by shooting champagne corks at all these creatures, which he would have devoured in his feast. And again, Poor William and Queen Adelaide were the subject also of ridicule. And this came out, this wonderful satirical lithograph by Robert Seymour called A Cheap Coronation, because there was no feast, and there'd been a feast ever since Rufus, in the Norman period. On the right, you see Lord Brougham, actually, who was the founder of the Reform Club, but also very much in favour of the Reform Act. And so there's a sort of political intent in this. So poor William didn't get his feast, and his wonderful set of ice cream coolers were never used at his coronation. And that is the survivor, basically. All of it's in the Royal Collection, but this is in the Museum of Royal Worcester, and it's probably from about 1829. It's a specimen plate, and it's just wonderful that the museum actually has this. And again, you can see all these heraldic orders around the royal arms. But let me now just talk a little bit about how these things were used and how they evolved. They appear, first of all, in the early 18th century, but they weren't made out of porcelain. And I'll come to that in a moment. But I've put up on there all of the different names which started to emerge during the course of the 18th century in the main languages, and they're often referred to with different names. This is a typical one from Sèvres. What they're based on is a very common piece of kitchen equipment called a daubier, or a braising pan. And what you do with these, you put them over some charcoal to cook a stew, which is inside the saucepan, but you also put hot coals in the lid as well. So the food is trapped between two sources of heat above and below. And during the course of the 18th century, these were adapted to keep things cold. They'd put them onto ice and put ice and salt in the lid as well. And you could actually put molded ice creams inside them. And gradually they made them mainly out of pewter, but the sour glass, or the ice pail, is really based on that principle. And the very first ones that have survived are made of earthenware with a tin glaze. This one, which is in the Sèvres Museum, is from Moustier, this faience manufactory, and dates from the 1720s. And you can see everything is there. You've got the little lid to put the ice and the salt in. Now, the thing is, these are very rare and they probably weren't very successful because the trouble with earthenware is the clay body behind the glaze is absorbent and the glaze gets crazing in it and the salt in the mixture will get absorbed as saline solution into the clay. And what happens is it starts to crack the glaze off. So they probably didn't last very long and many of them were probably thrown away. But when soft paste porcelain starts to be used at Sèvres, they start making a few ice pails out of it. And of course, it's a vitrified body. The salt can't get into it. So it's much more resilient and a much better medium for these. The very first one from Sèvres was a gift from the king, from Louis XV to Maria Theresia, the Empress of Austria, the Maria Theresia service, elements of which you are still around in various collections. I've never seen one of the seaux à glace. But what has survived is this tray, this soucoupe, which was for putting ice cream cups on. And it's got this wonderful green ribbon. It's a very, very important service. And we know from the inventories that there were some ice cream pails made in 1758 for this service. But this is a wonderful thing to regard because this wonderful seaux à glace made out of glass is in the Corning Museum, and it's a bit like one of those inspection hives. You know, you can see all the bees working. Here you can see where the ice goes in the bottom with the salt, the basin, which has the ice cream in, and then the lid itself on top. One of the earliest ones that I've come across in England is that in this wonderful service, which you can actually see at Welbeck Abbey in the Portman collection, you can see the two ice pails there. This is a full service made for the Duchess of Portland, Margaret Bentinck, probably in the 1770s, made at Chelsea. And this is one of mine, just to basically show you. This is a French one from the 1780s, probably. You can see I put some ice in the pail and I put some ice in the lid. You then sprinkle some coarse salt or saltpeter or a mixture into both of those. You put the basin in, put the lid on top and leave it to get cold for about half an hour. And all the porcelain will go well below freezing. You then can put the ice cream in, which you've made somewhere else, and you can put the lid on. Now that will keep this cold for 3 to 4 hours. The ice will melt, particularly in the top, but all you do is you take it off and charge it with more ice and salt, and then you can keep your ice cream cool for another hour or so. And one of the most wonderful moments in my life was working with Dame Rosalind Saville, and we did a porcelain handling session together at the Wallace collection about 12 years ago. And she'd never seen one of these being used. And we made some ice cream and put it in. And it was just such a wonderful moment with that much missed genius of a lady. And that's how it appears. Probably not on the table because you get condensation and your tablecloth gets a big damp patch on it. So these were really for a console table, a side table, which sometimes had a marble top. So, you know, that would have been the ideal furniture for putting it on. But just a few more little things that happen. Wedgwood, you know, again in the 1770s, they think it's going to be a little bit more useful if you put another element on it, a lid, which keeps the ice cold. So this particular type has got an extra part. It's got a lid that you put over the ice to act as an insulation. And probably, you know, one of the most famous pieces from Wedgwood was the frog service made for Catherine the Great of Russia. And here you can see all four elements. This time you've got this extra component which stops the ice from melting. And I think possibly there was even possibility that they would put a napkin over it before it was actually displayed to the guests. Now, you can't make ice cream without ice. And where on earth do you get ice from when you haven't got freezers? Well, in Britain, we know that the earliest ice house was built in Greenwich, in the grounds of the Queen's House, and that wonderful Inigo Jones building, which is still there, on a hill called Snow Hill. And we've just recently discovered where it was exactly. This is a 1676 engraving of Snow Hill from the observatory. And I don't know if you can see him, but there's a little man to the left of that mast, which actually has got a telescope on top of it, in a little kind of alcove in the wall, and he's looking out over Snow Hill. There he is. And can you see there's a little kind of arched building? Well, that probably is the 1618 ice house that was built for James I in Greenwich, and it's no longer there. But we discovered this just recently, and it's such a wonderful image to have. But at this point, there was no ice cream. The ice was just used to keep fish and meat cool and for other party tricks. But we didn't have any ice cream, probably even in Europe at this period. It's a bit later on. To store it, you had these ice houses. Sometimes they had a thatch covering over them. This is an incredible illustration from Robert Boyle of the Royal Society of how to construct one of these things. He wrote an experimental book, Touching Cold, or an experimental history of cold. It's a wonderful source book. But you'll notice over the pit, there is a thatched building, and there is one at Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, which is actually a reconstruction, but it's very much, these were all over Britain at one time, and over in France too. And so how was it made? Well, basically, you had a wooden bucket or pail full of ice and salt, into which you put a pewter pot with a lid on top, which was very tightly fitting. And you put your mixture in there. It could be a water ice or a sorbet, which didn't have any dairy material in it, or it could be an ice cream. And it had sugar in it, which was the most important ingredient. And you basically spun it round. You can see the little putto on the right is spinning these two pots with his hand, and another one on the left is using a kind of spaddle or a spoon to scrape it down. So here's another image from this wonderful book published in Nancy by Joseph Gillier, who was the confectioner to the deposed King of Poland. And you can see the whole kit again. And I use these. I've got quite a lot of them. And here's one of mine, exactly the same, on a table so that any meltwater can get away, and the spaddle. And so basically what you do is you fill your pail with ice and salt. You then put your mixture in and you spin it around with one of these things, and it turns from a liquid and quickly freezes. It can happen in 20 minutes, half an hour, sometimes 40 minutes at the most. You can freeze, a couple of pints of ice cream really easily. Then, of course, you can't serve it from that. I mean, especially in an aristocratic household, you had something very beautiful to serve it from. And back in 1999, and I worked at Waddesdon with the wonderful Rothschild collection, and actually had the joy of putting some 18th century ices. There's Epine Vinette, which is Barbary, the red one. There's pistachio and pan de siegle, which is rye bread ice cream, in these extraordinary little cups, and this plateau bourrée to put them on, which the waiter would take them from the console table. So they would then go round and give them to the guests, who would probably take them with their own hand using the handles. So there was a real kind of protocol of serving this stuff. And this is a typical 18th century console table at Waddesdon with this beautiful marble top, which is a perfect top for this. You're not getting any meltwater or anything, and you do get condensation from these things. And again, you can see another set here, another Sèvres set. This is a Starenburg service. And you can see there you've got the Soa glass, the ice cream pail on the left, but its partner, the cooler for the bottle of wine. And you can see why they were so wide to accommodate this very large bell-shaped 18th century wine bottle. And again, another set of cups, either with a soucoupe or a plateau boré. And the idea seems to have been to try and impress your guests by stacking up the ices until you got this very impressive kind of cone shape. I've tried it myself. This is a glass set here, and it works better with water ices than it does with ice creams. So here's a glass ice cream, 18th century one, an English one. So this is a fun thing I did in Washington, D.C. In 2012, where I used the elements of the Cardinal de Rohan Sèvres service that they had, which included a lot of ice cream cups. You can see one at each place setting around the table. And this was for Louis de Rohan. You can see I recycled that table marker with the little signature, the little cipher of Louis on it for this setting. The centerpiece is a surtout, which is covered in parterres made of chenille and with sugar flowers and sève, wonderful biscuit figures and some sugar architecture at the background. But taking a close look at that, this is a big moment in my life when I actually put some ice cream. Although this is fake ice cream, which I made, which lasted the duration of the exhibition. And these wonderful, again, birds, these extraordinary birds with this remarkable service. I mean, this was just, if you like, not a recreation, but an emulation, really, of what it probably was used for. Interestingly, as well as the cups, there would have been this stand as well, this soucoupe or plateau. We didn't have one there. That was the missing thing that we didn't have at the table. This one is in the Toledo Museum of Art. So ice cream cups. We're going to move back to England, move back to Worcester. And of all of the 19th century productions from the Worcester manufactory, there were the ice cream cups with their own little stands, these little saucers. And in some ways, they look forward almost to the 1920s and 30s with a kind of deco, like extraordinary, wonderful use of very simple geometric design. But this one has got a little painting of a woodcutter on it, and the other one that's in the collection has got this view of Virginia water. But again, different colours, but the very same design, at least for the little saucer, which, so you're just sort of moving back now into 19th century ice cream porcelain material in the Worcester collection. So something happens, actually. It starts to happen in the 17th century. As well as serving ice cream from little servers on the table, which we only know about from the 1720s, ice creams were also molded into novelty shapes, mainly fruits, but all sorts of things. This is an extraordinary image. It's of a festival. Actually, it was a birthday party of one of the Holy Roman Empresses, Elizabeth Christina, in Italy, in Rome, in 1714. In fact, it was August the 28th, 1714. And this is the interval ice cream service. It's the equivalent of when the lady used to come round in the cinema with a tray. But this was served to the guests at the Palazzo Odescalchi in 1714, in the middle of the Ferragosto. This is the hottest time in Rome. And 150 ice cream makers were hired to create this extraordinary temple, well, an altar, if you like, many altars to ice cream. To give you an idea of its scale, at the very summit of the middle table, there is an ice cream garden, sorry, an ice garden. It's made of ice, and it's the size of ones that you might see in a big country house garden. And in it, there's a tree, an artificial tree, which was hung with 150 ice cream citrus fruits. And these were being made in Italy in the 17th century, and they basically were called pezzi duri, hard pieces. You couldn't eat them. When they came out of the mold, they were as hard as rock. You had to let them thaw out. They were perfectly edible if you left them for 20 minutes, half an hour. And they shoot up all over Europe. All the confectioners are making them. On the left of this photograph, you can see a pewter mold to make a pineapple. It only makes the body of the pineapple and it is marked. It came from a very important confectionery in Berkeley Square that belonged to a man called Domenico Negri, founded in the late 1750s with his wife, a woman called Elizabeth Gunter, who was also a confectioner. So what you did was you cut the fruit, the leaves of the pineapple off, and you put them on top of your artificial frozen one. And on the right, you can see again one of the pewter sorbetier, these pots that were used to make the ice cream, and a spaddle. That particular one was from the same shop when it became known as Gunter's, named after it's in my collection. So it's quite an interesting. This was for an exhibition at the Fitzwilliam back in 2020. And you know, they had ice cream molds in the form of asparagus. It wasn't asparagus flavored, but you know, just made of water ice with green spinach green at one end. And look at this. This is a mid-Victorian ice cream mold to make a basket of flowers. And just look at this. When they come out of the mold, they're as hard as rock. And they're so cold that any moisture in the atmosphere will condense on them and create this extraordinary rime frost, which is a miracle to behold, really. And you know, you only find out about this kind of thing by actually doing it. And then they can sit as a centerpiece on a Victorian dessert table, or even on the main table with all of the food around it, and they're going to stay. That big one will stay like that for an hour before it's edible. The smaller molds, the garnishing molds, look at that lovely little raspberry tart and the little apricot, just beautiful. And again, here's a little, these are very Victorian. If you look at the swan, you can see how the frozen rime frost from the atmosphere creates something a little like feather down. It's absolutely ridiculous, you know. So another bonkers bird, this time a frozen swan. I'd like to finish by looking at a later ice cream vessel from Worcester, which was part of a very ambitious dessert service, which was made especially to be displayed at the great Dublin exhibition in 1853. You all know about the great exhibition that took place in the Crystal Palace a few years before this. Well, this is another one that was held in Dublin. Again, a kind of enormous glass kind of conservatory structure was built especially for it. It was built in the grounds of Leinster House. With a frontage along Merrion Square, if you know Dublin, big square. And it was a little bit of a flop. The reason being, if you think about it, this really was an exhibition of high status decorative objects, some of them made of silver, wood, carpentry, furniture, everything really, but aimed really at the great and the good. And Ireland had just gone through almost a decade when you had the huge potato famine. And the exhibition didn't get many visits, which was quite understandable, really. So unlike the London one, it was a terrible flop. But one of the really striking items was this extraordinary dessert service, which represented A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. And it included lots and lots of lovely little dessert figures, which basically are the 19th century equivalent of the ones I showed you earlier. If you remember the big table at Wadston with the Choiseul service and the figures from another one, and also the sugar figures, you know, in that Renaissance table I showed you from the Fitzwilliam. But amongst these figures and these compots, you can see on the left an ice cream pail, which is very, very, very interesting. I just point out actually, you can see bottom up there, you know, he's been turned into an ass, and some of the other figures in the Midsummer Night's Dream. It's an extraordinary service. A large number of these items are visible in the Royal Worcester Museum in a special case. Basically, the various people worked on this. Mr. Bott was a sort of chief pixie. It's an extraordinary item. It's very high Victorian. And here is the ice cream pail. Obviously, when you lift that lid off, there's another element which has the ice in. So it's based on the Wedgwood innovation of having another element on top, which keeps the ice cold. But what is unbelievable is the fact that you also are allowed to use it like this. This is an amphora which you fill with wine, probably white wine, because you put it in the top and it becomes an ice cooler. And I've never seen anything like that anywhere in the whole universe, actually. So again, a really marvelous item, which really captivated me when I was at the museum. I'm going to finish there, really. I'm just going to mention the fact that the next talk in this series is by two colleagues of mine, Dr. Neil Buttery. It was Neil actually who introduced me to Rebecca and invited me to do this talk. And of course, Paul Crane, who is an old friend and colleague, who is a direct descendant of Dr. Wall. So I don't miss this one. It's on the 6th of March, and it's about sugar slavery and Worcester porcelain sucrier. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ivan, and thank you very much for promoting our next winter talk. I'll just quickly say, if you haven't registered for the next talk, please do. All the information is on our website. Thank you to so thank you, Ivan, for that talk. We've got a few minutes left. So if anybody would like to ask any questions for Ivan, do pop them in the Q&A box. And I'll try and get those. We can try and get some answered before we finish at 7. But I just want to quickly say that I think the best word to describe that talk, Ivan, is delicious. both the ice cream and the ices, but also the porcelain. The examples that you showed there were just delicious, wonderful. And it's thank you for the journey that you've taken us on. We've seen not only how the ice pails are decorated, how they were used, but also how they were, how they would have been, how the dessert course would have looked like as well. Really kind of opening our eyes to that. One question that I have for myself while we're waiting for some answers is, why ice cups? Why were they put into little cups with little handles instead of the tiny little bowls?
Well, it's quite interesting. There's a lot of mystery about these things. The first illustrations on them are mainly of glass, and there were silver ones too. They weren't just exclusively made from porcelain. But the thing is that they were normally served from a salver, like a glass of wine. You're in a very posh company when you own these objects. So they're served by a waiter who probably comes from a console table with this plateau or salver with them on. And of course, it means he's holding it by the foot of the salver, which means that the heat from his hand cannot melt them, okay? Because the capacity of the bowl in the ice cream pails is very small, you only got a small amount. So you had a little tiny cup to have it from, and it had to remain cold. If it didn't have a handle, then you basically, but what you're talking about is a little tiny bowl on the table in front of you. But basically, it came around and you took the cup yourself. The waiter wouldn't have handled yours, like he didn't handle your wine glass. You took it off the salver, and of course, the main thing was to keep it cold. So, you didn't pick it up like a bowl. I don't know. I mean, that's how it was done. Most of the ones that have survived have got little handles on them, including those wonderful 19th century ones too. There's so many mysteries in this, really. Good question.
Yeah, but it makes a lot of sense. A sense though to yeah, to have the little handle so you don't, yeah, transfer of the heat from your hands doesn't yeah, defrost the ice cream. We have just got one question come through from Richard White, who says, I've seen an 18th century served porcelain ice pail liner with decoration other than a gilt line along the rim. However, your slide of the Worcester ice pail with the bird decoration also pictured a beautifully decorated matching liner. So did the Worcester Porcelain Factory often decorate their ice pail liners?
The ones that I have seen, a lot of them have it, not all of them. It may have been, I don't know, it may have been an extra thing that a client could have. I really don't know. But I showed you some good examples. The Jabberwocky one, which I showed you, which is in Houston, in Rienzi Museum, is so profusely decorated in and out. I've heard about Sev ones, but they seem to be few and far between, which have ornaments. I've seen quite a few Vienna porcelain ones, which have got ornamentation in them. So it was happening in some of the European manufactories. But it seems to be something that maybe was considered unnecessary because to the diners who might see when the waiter takes the lid off the sour glass, you're not going to see the designs underneath the ice. You might do. You certainly see them around the rim, and you're not going to see the designs in the bowl, which is full of the ice cream or sorbet. But Worcester seems to be the place where it happened the most frequently. Um, I hope that answers your question, Richard.
Thank you, Ivan. I'll just ask a couple of more questions and then we'll finish for the evening. So Alexandra says, this was fascinating, thank you. You showed an example of an Italian banquet table. Would they have used porcelain from Sèvres or Worcester or other manufacturers? Do you have any recommendations for museum collections or books to consult to learn more about ice cream in Italy specifically?
Now I think I didn't show any Italian settings. I showed an English table from the early 17th century, which would not have had ice cream on it, which had got some Italianate objects on it, in fact, But I mean, the Italian manufactories were producing these so a glace. I'm not totally sure about works in Italian on this. There are a number of books, but not many on this. I'm still working on a big one. I produced a small one for Bloomsbury a few years ago. Um, but I'm afraid that's something I can't really answer. Um, I know that there are one or two scholars who are working on Italian ice cream culture at the moment.
Well, thank you, Ivan. If anything comes to mind, Alexandra, we can always send it across to you.
Yeah,
Um,
Oliver Ruccolai comes to my mind as an Italian scholar who's got a real interest in Italian ice cream culture. And I knew she was planning an exhibition. I don't know whether it happened, but so that's Oliver Ruccolai. You might be able to find out from her.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ivan. And we'll just finish off. There's been two questions about the fun ice cream flavours. So can you enlighten us to a few more?
Yeah. One of the most extraordinary books that appeared was a book which was published in Nancy by a man called Joseph Gillier, who became the confectioner to the deposed King of Poland. And he has an ice cream which contains this Parmesan ice cream. It's grated, melted Parmesan. You melt it into a custard and then freeze it. And what's extraordinary is that in his book, he illustrates a mold to cast it in, and it's in the form of a wedge of cheese. So it was served on the table, as a wedge of cheese. This often happened. They made them in all sorts of interesting shapes. I showed you the ones that were made like asparagus, for instance. But what is interesting, in the 19th century, um, one of the 19th century pewter manufactories in France, um, they actually produced a cheese ice cream mold, which was in the form of a wedge of Emmental cheese with the bubbles in it. So when it came out, it was ice cream, but it had these bubbles. But they also produced a little mold of a mouse that you could make out of ice cream and sit it on top. There are other molds, for instance. There's one mold I've got which allows you to make an egg cup out of ice cream, and another mold which makes a yolk around which you can put inside a third one which makes the egg. So you get a yellow apricot flavored yolk with a white vanilla ice cream, and then you have a ice cream egg cup to eat it out of, which is made of nougat ice cream. There were lots of strange flavors, lots of perfumes, musk, ambergris were used, all of the floral waters, things like tuberose and jonquil, all those things, orange flowers, rose water, and a lot of alcoholic ones too, all sorts of strange concoctions. I think there's well over 100 recipes in a later French book. By a woman or man called Emmy. We don't know who they were, but it's full of French ice cream. And of course, a lot of the English ones have got some pretty weird flavors as well. And that settles down. And I think now, with the great interest in it, that chefs and ice cream makers are all trying to think of weird things to put in their ice cream. I've come across some diabolical things, which I'm not going to mention.
Wonderful, Ivan. There's some very strange, strange ice cream flavors. I'm not sure I'd feel about tasting all of those. Well, thank you so very much. Thank you for everyone's questions. We haven't had a chance to answer them all, but we will send them over to Ivan and to get him to respond to them for you. Thank you to everyone for attending this evening. We had over 113 at one point, which is amazing. So thank you everyone to attending. Please join us on the next talk. And thank you again, Ivan, very much.
A pleasure.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much, Ivan. I didn't get a chance to say thank you for joining us right at the very beginning. I was just so excited